Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to conclude our conversation with Brant Gardner, the author of Plates of Mormon, as well as Engraven upon Plates, Written upon Paper. So you should definitely check out those books and add them to your collection. In our final conversation with Brant, we're going to be talking about infant baptism. Was that really in the Book of Mormon? Alexander Campbell had a big problem with it. What does Brant Gardner think about it? You won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. So jumping back to...
Engraven upon plates, printed upon paper.
Perfect. So one of the things that I found really interesting in that book was the translation process, because you compared it, not only the translation of the Book of Mormon, but you talked about the Joseph Smith translation and Book of Abraham. And I'd love to go into more detail on that, about how those are similar and different. I thought that was really interesting.
What's really important, first of all, is that Joseph Smith is present. And the question is, what is his presence doing in those translation events? So how much of Joseph Smith shows up in the Book of Mormon? And of course, there is a discussion because Royal Skousen and Stanford Carmack have looked at the language and looked at early modern English and decided that Joseph Smith could not have done that, and therefore someone else must have written this text. And so Joseph just read exactly what was there. And under that theory of translation, Joseph did not participate mentally, actively.
This is kind of the tight translation model,
That's
right?
the very tight translation.
Right.
Well, yeah, Skousen uses that concept differently, but the way most of us use tight translation, that's what that is. He's reading words that somebody else wrote. So Joseph, his language, his mind was not present in those things. And that becomes a question. So setting that aside, without saying anything about that particular at the moment, the next question is, that wasn't the only thing Joseph ever translated. So what else do we know? Well, we know that Joseph Smith translated a parchment of John. Well, he saw it in vision. We don't have it. I suppose it's possible that some, prior person also translated that, just like they translated the Book of Mormon, but there's no indication. He just gives us the information. Then we have the translation of the Bible, and Joseph always calls it a translation. He says he's a translator. He says he's translating, and we know exactly what he was doing because we can see it. You can compare texts side by side, and for much of what he did early on, he would write out the text, but later on, when he got tired of writing out the whole text, he would just put notes in. And so you know for an absolute fact that for a lot of what he was doing in the Joseph Smith translation is he was going from English to English. He was translating words that were somewhat problematic into less problematic English. For example, he really didn't like the idea of God repenting. Theologically, God repenting didn't work. And so whenever it said, it repenteth God or God repented or
You're
whatever.
talking about in the Book of Genesis.
Book of Genesis or anywhere in the Bible, anywhere in that Joseph went through, if he saw God repenting, he changed it to something else so that we don't have that theological problem of saying, what's God got to repent of? And of course, that goes back to actual translation of Hebrew and lots of other things. But very clearly, what's happening is Joseph is there. He's seeing a word in English. He's translating it, shifting the meaning into another. Now, what he's doing in a lot of it, of course, is revelatory. The Book of Moses, that's not the translation. That's as revelation that's coming out. It was never written that anybody knows about, so we can't say he was translating a text. This is revelation. Okay, we go to Doctrine and Covenants. Those are revelations. We have descriptions of how Joseph received them, and he would dictate them, and the descriptions of how he dictated the texts for the revelations that we have in the Doctrine and Covenants, very much the same dictation method as we have for the Book of Mormon. And yet, it's very clear that he was not reading a text for those revelations. It's very clear that the language is quite similar. It's very clear that he did not consider them finished because sometimes he would go back and add paragraphs in.
Right.
It was sort of like, when I was doing that, I didn't explain that well enough. I know what's supposed to be. Let me give you some more information so you understand that the way I understand it. And you can almost see Joseph thinking, I know this stuff. It has been revealed to me. My language is diminished, or, I'm human, and therefore it's hard to get divine ideas into human language. And so he has to explain it again. But very clearly, Joseph is present. Book of Abraham is fascinating because the Book of Abraham happened in a couple of different translation instances. And when I was at Education Week recently, I was talking to Matt Gray, who has done work looking at Joseph Smith learning Hebrew. And there's lots of interesting things about that, but the most fascinating thing is you can see Hebrew words in the translation of the Book of Abraham, but only in the part of Abraham that was translated after Joseph had learned those words. And the inserted words are in the transcription method that his teacher, Joshua Seixas, was using. So you know very, very well that these words are here because they are now part of Joseph's vocabulary. And as he's translating, these words are now part of his vocabulary and he starts using them. Well, again, that tells us that Joseph's mind was present. This isn't some other thing that he's reading from. Something else is going on. And there's lots of things we could discuss about translation. But that was another book. I did that one before. But I think what happens on all of these is that if you look at Joseph Smith's translation projects, on every one of them, it is almost inarguable that Joseph's mind was present. Now we will argue about the Book of Mormon, and that's the only one where we argue that maybe he wasn't. Parsimony to me says that, yeah, Joseph Smith was also present for that one, and that there were word choices that come because he was there. I think if you look at the way New Testament quotations are being used in the Book of Mormon, I think it's very clear that these are coming because Joseph knows the quotation, knows what is supposed to be communicated, and the words that he knows best are coming from the New Testament phrases. So I think that there is a preponderance of evidence that says Joseph Smith's mind was present, and Royal Skousen and Stanford Carmack will still be contrary to that theory and still don't agree with me.
Yeah, well, I think they're in the minority, though. I think most scholars of the Book of Mormon are in what we would call the loose translation camp, because I know one of your chapters in here. Let me pull this up really quick. Is 19th century influence on the text, and then translation artifacts in the English text.
Yeah.
So can you talk about clearly 19th century items that are in the Book of Mormon that probably weren't in our Book of Mormon, that weren't
in the Nephite Book of Mormon. Yeah. One of them that always comes up are anachronisms. Okay. And so everybody says, what about a horse? What about the donkey or the goat and all these? And
silk, elephants, all that stuff.
All of those things. We always forget that the Book of Mormon was not originally written in English. It was written in some other language. And so we have it in English. And so I think these are what I would call translation artifacts or translation anachronisms. And it's very much like we know in the New Testament, we're very familiar with the scripture that says that if you've got a candle and you should light your candle, you put it on a candlestick, you shouldn't put your candle under a bushel. We know that. And most people can cite it better than I can. But we know that scripture. What we forget is that they had no candles and they had no bushels. You couldn't put a candle under a bushel because there was no such thing as a bushel, and there was no such thing as a candle. They used oil lamps. Now, is the New Testament wrong? Because the King James Version people didn't say oil lamp, they said candle. Well, no, that was a translator's choice. Is it an anachronism? Technically. Is it anything that we worry about? Not at all. No, because we have the original. We know what the original was, and there's no problem there. Of course, the problem in the Book of Mormon is you don't have the original, but still, the concept of a translation anachronism, it's pretty clear that certain of these really have to be. Now, what's another one that I think is more interesting?
What about things like infant baptism? Would you call that an anachronism?
No.
Alexander Campbell had an issue with it.
Yeah, clearly. He had an issue with it, and my understanding of that is entirely dependent upon the fact that what I do is I take the Book of Mormon and I say, is there a place in the world that this could have taken place? And then what I've done historically over the last 30 some odd years is put it in that place and said, how well does it fit? Well, Mesoamerica is the best fit that I can find. And I'm not a geographer, so if you're going to ask me where the narrow neck is,
you're
or the narrow pass.
What?
Somebody else can play with that stuff. I want to find out how the text fits with the culture in that area.
I thought you were Mr. Mezzo.
Only in certain aspects. For example, somebody recently asked me, what's my opinion about the narrow pass inside the narrow neck? I have no opinion about that whatsoever.
Oh.
I have no idea. Somebody who's been on the ground down there will probably have a better idea. But there are lots of things that happen in that area, and it just so happens that we have the records of the Spanish who come in and they watch both the Maya and the Aztecs washing infants, and they call it a baptism because it's a washing. Now, the cultural reason for doing it, totally different than a Christian baptism. But the parallel is close enough there that if someone wanted to kind of mesh those things together, I can see where somebody would be taking, that kind of concept and then merging it together with, Christian ideas. So I think actually the reason that it's there is because there were people who were doing something similar, and apostate Nephites were saying, or other people were saying, well, that seems like a pretty good practice. I'd like to do that. I think that'd be a good idea. To give you the parallel to that one, we often talk about sprinkling children. And it happens more with children, but the whole idea of sprinkling rather than immersion. And it's very clear in early Christian documents that immersion was the preferred way to baptize. Well, it turns out that in Greek burial customs, and you were really supposed to bury someone if you happened upon them, but it said if you don't have the time to bury them down in the earth, to have the immersion into the earth, you can sprinkle 3 handsful of dirt on their head, and that's a symbolic burial. And in the Didache, it says you should baptize in running water by immersion. But if you don't, 3 handsful of water on the head. Oh, where did that come from? Greek burial practice, symbolic burial in baptism. They start to fuse each other, and you get these cultural fusions. So I think that's what's happening with infant baptism. I think there's, evidence of something that was close enough to it that we know why somebody was calling it that and what was happening and the reason why Mormon and Moroni had to talk about it.
Okay. So are you saying these ceremonial washings, were they baptism or they were just like baptism?
Like baptism.
Okay.
Baptism has a symbolic meaning for us that we attach to washing away sin. They were washing away heat. They were washing, babies are kind of messy when they're born, so you kind of want to clean them up. But while you're doing that, they would do something else with the washing that was symbolic. And if I remember correctly, it was heat that they were washing away because of the concepts that they had of, heat in the body and other kinds of concepts. So I think what was behind the Mesoamerican idea is very much different, just like what we have with the hands full of dirt on the head with the Greeks started off as something that was different, and then the ideas kind of merged. And those kinds of things happen throughout history. It's not unusual for those things to happen at all.
Okay. Well, very good. I'm trying to look here. What else?
Well, while you're looking at it, let me tell you one more that I think is a 19th century artifact in the text. And this goes into the fact that Joseph is dictating. There are a lot of incomplete sentences in the Book of Mormon, and no matter what you do, you just can't make them work. Now, sometimes they do, and Skousen found a lot of these, and many of them just fade. It's sort of like, I don't know where I am in this sentence. I just go to the next one. I'll just stop. And so there are some where they just fade, and you never really actually have an end of the sentence. And then some of them, there isn't really much of an end, but what will happen is repetitive resumption, where you say, okay, well, this is what I was trying to say at the beginning. I'll repeat it, and that'll be the end of it, and then I can go on. Well, it turns out these things happen when you get 3 or more internal clauses in a sentence. And it just so happens that there's only so much memory that we have, and it's hard to hold certain things in memory. And in looking at short-term memory, there's only lists of like 10 elements, items that we can hold for 30 seconds or so. And if you look at the way the text was being dictated, sometimes these sentences are going on past the dictation level. And you look at it and you say, Joseph lost track. Now, if he were reading, he wouldn't lose track because he just kept reading. But if he has to keep track of the beginning of a sentence, and you'll get them a lot with, and after so-and-so did such and such, which was part of this and was part of that, and then they did this, and then and that's where you lose it. You never get back to the after they did that, they did this. It never gets resolved because he can't hold it in memory. And to me, that says you got a mental participation in this thing where the known limits of short-term memory are coming into play in the dictation, and we get these sentences because Joseph just couldn't hold that much information in his mind long enough to get those sentences out. Now, you remember I had talked about repetitive resumption with that long one with the shiblons and the ontais and all of that kind of that great big long one. What I find most fascinating is that also uses repetitive resumption. And what we have is on the sentence level, the repetitive resumption and the incomplete sentences, I think, are really good markers that say Joseph Smith's mind was present and he wasn't reading a text. When you get to these long ones, those same memory issues tell you that he was translating a text. There was a written text that he was working with. So he isn't reading the English, but he's working with the text that was written down.
Okay. Very good. I wanted to ask you, since you talked a little bit about the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, and I know your book's about the Book of Mormon, but, Thomas Wayment has come out with this paper in which he said Adam Clarke was involved. Or, that Joseph used Adam Clarke's commentary on the Bible. I know recently the interpreter, I want to say his name is Jackson. I don't know if that's the right name, but somebody.
Keith Jackson.
Keith Jackson? That sounds like the ABC and that football announcer, but anyway.
At least I think that's who it was.
Anyway, I think his name was Jackson. He kind of took issue with Thomas Wayman.
He did.
And said, I don't think this is quite so strong. Where do you fit on that?
I'm going to get myself in trouble in this answer.
I know, that's what we're all about.
Yeah, thanks. If they're excommunicating me next week, it'll be your fault. I have a problem with many Latter-day Saint apologists because their immediate reaction to something that sounds bad about the Book of Mormon or Joseph's translation or anything else, something really looks like it might be damaging, there is a knee-jerk reaction to just deny it and pretend that it doesn't exist and do whatever they can to push back on it. This is one of them.
Oh, okay.
So Thomas Wayman comes out and he says, here's evidence that there are some phrases and things that are coming in from Clarke's commentary that really don't have any other good explanation. And the response is, oh, no, there's other explanations for everything else. Well, except the ones that he didn't talk about. And I no longer remember the specifics, but I know I looked at, both the rebuttal article, I looked at what Wayman had, and Wayman's right.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and you'll remember that I'm not unhappy about that because I think Joseph participated in the translation anyway. So it doesn't bother me at all because I agree Joseph Smith's mind was present.
And Thomas said, read out of the best books. Those were the best books at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't a problem. And, I really don't see an issue with it whatsoever. But there are many that will have this knee-jerk reaction that says, okay, I've got to put it down. And the same kind of thing happened when they were looking, his name is going to slip me because names slip me these days. But you looked at the use of italicized words in Isaiah and how a lot of them had been changed. And
we probably should talk about why those words are italicized in the King James Bible anyway. We've kind of hinted at it, but I think
just to make sure that people know. They are italicized because there are languages, Hebrew being one of them, that are not required to put in all of the words that we would put in an English sentence. And if you have people who are listening who speak Spanish, Spanish does the exact same thing. Because of the conjugation, you can tell by the word, the verb, you can tell if it's a he, if it's a singular or a plural subject. The subject is part of the verb, and so you don't have to say the subject. Well, Hebrew's much like that. And so what happened is there are words that we have to put in that aren't there in Hebrew technically. And so they decided they would mark those by italicizing them. And so you'll get he's, you'll get is, because in many cases you don't, in Hebrew you can say this thing, and you know that this is this. You know that there's a comparison, and they don't have to say it. Well, we have to say it. And because English had to say it, they put the words in. And so people seem to have understood that. Joseph seems to have understood that. And he seems to have understood that those were added words. And so he took some of them out and removed the italicized words. Not always.
Which would better match the Hebrew or the Greek, I guess. Or is it in Greek as well?
No, I think it's only in Hebrew.
It's only in Hebrew?
I don't remember.
Okay.
It only shows up in the Book of Mormon for the Isaiah stuff, so that's where I remember it.
Okay.
But it's very clear that he's cutting them out. And then what happens is sometimes he just leaves them out, and it really makes a mess of the sentence. And he doesn't fix it. And you just read it and you go, okay, that doesn't make any sense. Then what you do is you find out that in other cases, what he does is he realizes that the sentence doesn't make any sense anymore. And so he has to add words that weren't there in the Hebrew to get around the fact that he took out a word. So he has to fix it by breaking it worse than it was in the first part. And of course, because it was Joseph, we assume that that was inspired and there's some heavy meaning in it. And then you read them and no, there isn't any heavy meaning. It's just trying to make sense out of the sentence. And again, that does not bother me because I think that just tells us what the process was like. And it tells us that Joseph Smith really did have a role to play in the translation and that he wasn't a professional translator. I think that's a given. But that's where that issue comes in. And the stuff that Wayman is finding, it's a similar kind of thing where it's a phrase or two and you look at it, and I'm trying to remember one of them for some reason I think had to do with unicorns, where there was a specific
I know in the Bible it refers to unicorns.
It refers to unicorn, and then
some people think it's a rhinoceros.
Yeah,
it's a single-horned animal.
Whatever it was, and again, doesn't. There's all kinds of things that show up that we don't really know what it was. But whatever it was, there was a change that was made that it was not an obvious change, but it was very clearly exactly the same change that Adam Clarke had suggested. And it's not the kind of thing that you're going to randomly come up with. You're not going to do that unless someone has put that idea in your head. So again, for me, I thought it was quite conclusive. I'm not as unhappy with that issue as some other people have been.
Okay. Well, very good. Because I've talked to another couple of BYU professors, and they were like, yeah, I think Thomas is all wrong. So it surprised me that you came up with that position. That's interesting.
Yeah, and I think there is something about orthodoxy that says that we have to say that he's wrong because we have this idea that Joseph should have been perfect in what he was doing. And I think Joseph would be the very first one to say, I never said that. No, that's not the way it was. Now, I think Joseph also very clearly told us all he knew about the translation, which was that it was by the gift and power of God. Other than that, I have no clue. I don't think he knew.
So I looked it up. It's Kent Jackson, not Keith Jackson.
There we go. You're right, Kent. I knew there was a K in there somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. So very good. Anything else with regards to 19th century elements in the Book of Mormon that you can think of?
No, I think that's the majority of them. Most of what I was trying to do there is recognize that there are some, and contrary to Skousen and Carmack, I think the presence of faux King James English or imitative King James English, I think that's there as an artifact of that time period. I think if the Book of Mormon had been translated 100 years later, we would not have seen that language there.
Okay. What about Nephi and Jacob's use of source text? What can you tell us there?
That one's really quick. They use the brass plates, and what's different about the way Jacob and Nephi do it that is different from anybody else in the Book of Mormon is that, and we know this because of Nephi and Isaiah, they'll use a whole chapter. Now, what they do with that chapter is interesting because they'll give you a chapter, but they're really only interested in like one or two verses. And so here's the chapter, and then they go riff on 2 or 3 verses out of that, and they pull them out and they create their sermon. And so for most of us, we're going, well, why don't you just take the verses out? And I think one of the reasons is I suspect that Nephi did not know how much of the brass plates would be preserved for posterity. Would the people eventually reading this actually have Isaiah, or does he have to give us Isaiah so that we know what it was? I suspect that's part of it. The rest of it was just the way he did things. It's, I want you to know what the whole context is. Here's Isaiah. All right, now that you've seen Isaiah, here's what I want to talk about, and then he will pull things out. But both he and Jacob will put that whole text in and then pull a little piece out. And they're the only ones who do that.
Okay. So it's interesting you mentioned the brass plates because that's another area where some scholars will push back on the legitimacy of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
Because they're going to say, and I believe, hopefully I'm right on this, that like the Book of Deuteronomy didn't exist until after Nephi would have left. And so how would it have gotten on the brass plates? What would you say to that?
That the information that's there sort of tells you that there was something on the brass plates. Now, whether it's exactly the same or not, I don't know. It's a very parallel one to the Isaiah problem with second Isaiah. Second Isaiah shouldn't have been there if second Isaiah is written after the Exodus. Not the Exodus, but the Babylonian exile.
Right.
Exile, not Exodus.
Right.
And there are lots of different theories that people will give you. I will give you mine.
Okay.
And people can say, oh, well, that's weird. Here's what I think happens with Isaiah. I think that in the Old World, Isaiah wrote something that was a core of what we have as Second Isaiah, and that one of his editors and students said, "Oh, this really fits coming out of the exile," and rewrote it and contextualized it to come out of the exile. So regardless of how it was written, I think it was rewritten and edited to come after the exile. So I think there are elements of Second Isaiah that are based on the fact that it was, and again, I think edited after the exile. So how does that show up in the Book of Mormon? Well, Joseph. He wasn't translating word for word off of the plates. Joseph knew what the Isaiah was, and so we got the Isaiah in King James. And it's very clear that the Isaiah we have is King James and not a fresh translation. So because we get the King James version, we get the edited version. What did the Nephites have? Well, my guess is they had something different. They had whatever Isaiah wrote before his later editors changed it and made it more appropriate for Babylon. That's my opinion. There is a paper, Joshua Sears, I believe, collected the various ways LDS scholars have responded to that and put them in a paper. And as I remember, he doesn't necessarily choose one. He just says, here's what people say are the options.
Okay.
So if you want to know what other people would think about that and what the options are, his papers, and I forget where it's published, in a book form somewhere, I think. Anyway, that would be a place to go.
All right. Are you familiar with Val Larson? You know who Val Larson is?
I must be.
Okay. So
I certainly know the name. I'm trying to decide whether or not I've met him, and I may have, and it depends on whether I'm remembering the name correctly.
So, and I don't know if you go to BoM's, Val goes there a lot. He's at, I want to say George Mason University. I think that's right. Or James Madison, one of those two. But he has come on my podcast and talked a little bit about how he thinks that Lehi specifically was more of a polytheist than a monotheist. And so he pulls in a lot of the Asherah stories into there and says that Lehi was rebelling against King Josiah's reforms, and that King Josiah wanted to become a monotheist, and the true, and as you look at Israelite theology of the day, they were definitely the Canaanite deities and that sort of thing. And so he's trying to pull a lot of that together. Wondering if you've studied that very much.
Yeah, and a lot of that is coming. Margaret Barker came to BYU a number of years ago.
I need to meet her.
Nice lady. I've only met her once or twice, but and then just in passing. So she wouldn't have a clue who I was. But she's sort of an interesting scholar, but became very much a part of people looking at the Book of Mormon because she had these ideas about how religion was being changed and the differences between the First Temple and Second Temple. And there are a lot of concepts that she had where you listen to them and you go, oh, that explains it.
Yeah, I know a lot of people like Margaret because she talks about temple, and so she's very attractive to LDS people who like to see that. Especially
she's also controversial. So one of the things I've had to do is kind of back away from Margaret Barker just because she's controversial. But that doesn't mean that all of the ideas were bad. You just have to kind of explain them in some other ways. Now, when you go back to what Val Larson was saying, I'd probably quibble with terminology more than with concepts. The whole idea of monotheism, monotheism is a very late development in Judaism as far as the way we consider monotheism. They were monotheistic very, very early, but their version of monotheism was Yahweh is our God. You've got a God, and you've got a God, and they've got a whole bunch of gods, but we have one. So they had a world, their mental world had lots of gods in it, but there was only one God that belonged to them. They belonged to the one God. Jehovah, Yahweh was their God. And so their version of monotheism is he's our national God. Now, Yahweh had a father, and there was a council in heaven, and there were 70 of these gods. And in their number 70 was one of ours, like, well, if I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times. It was one of those big numbers that doesn't have a meaning other than everything.
Yeah.
40 was another one, 40 years in the wilderness. How long were they there? 40 years, man. Maybe 10, maybe 15. It didn't matter.
It was
40
years
days
and 40 nights.
Yeah. I mean, those are big numbers that, they're not intended to tell you there was exactly that amount of time. And there were 70 gods. Well, there are 70 gods because there were 70 nations, and every god, every child of the Father in the council in heaven got a country to be the god of the country. So there is a God the Father, and there is Yahweh, but there's other gods for other people as well. So they weren't monotheistic the way we think of it. So saying that Lehi was not monotheistic, that he was polytheistic, I think that misunderstands fundamentally the concept of deity that they would have had in ancient Israel. We might call it polytheistic because it doesn't fit the way we think of it, but I don't think that's how they understood it. Now, what about Asherah?
Yeah.
Well, I think they knew Asherah. I think they were quite familiar with stories about Asherah. I think that the idea that that Asherah as a tree and as a mother, linking it to the tree of life,
right?
I think that's exactly the only way. Yeah, and Dan Peterson was the one who came up with that originally, and it's sort of looking at it, and I'm thinking, yeah, the guy's got to be right, because otherwise that story makes zero sense when you read Nephi's version of it. So Nephi retells his father's story of the tree of life, but he only does that as an introduction. Lehi did things after that and preached other kinds of things, and there's little hints of it there, but Nephi doesn't talk about it because he doesn't care. He said, I want to get on to mine. This is my experience. My dad had this vision there, and I wanted to know what it was. And so we spend too much time on the individual symbols of the water and the tree and the fruit and everything. And we forget that as soon as that goes, all of a sudden it becomes what he really wanted to talk about, which is there's Mary with a child. Here is the mother of God. Go back to the way it was in the printer's manuscript and in 1830.
Yeah.
But if you think about how—
Not the mother of the Son of God, yeah.
Well, that's how it was changed.
Right.
Yeah. But if you think about that, why would they call her the mother of God? Well, Abinadi says God himself will come down. Who did they think their God was? Yahweh. Who did they think the Messiah or Christ was? Well, Yahweh becomes Christ. We don't have any quibble with that at all. So if Christ comes down and he is on earth, Yahweh in the heavens, God himself came down. We don't mind that theology. And in that concept of theology, Mary really was the mother of God. That's Yahweh. That's Yahweh in his human form. Now, we have other reasons why we expand that, because we have a different theology and a different thing that we think of with the Godhead and all of the Christian things that have grown up around it. But if you go back to what the Israelite would have believed, yeah, that's perfectly fine. It was a better translation, frankly, for what the Nephites believed. So, yeah, do I believe that they would have understood stories of Asherah? Absolutely. Did they worship Asherah? Well, no, they worshiped Yahweh. What was the relationship of Asherah and Yahweh? There is an incense stand that has an inscription on it that is Yahweh and his consort, Asherah. Yeah. Basically, they understood that she was Yahweh's, wife, heavenly mother, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not that becomes an official theology, everybody would have understood it. These are stories that people know. And there is always a difference between the head church theologians and what everybody else actually believes. The popular, what we believe and how we understand it, pulls in a lot of history. It just like you go to any Sunday school class and you can tell that that a lot of Protestants have joined the church. We get a little bit of Protestant theology mixed in with our Sunday school stuff because it's kind of the way we grew up before we joined the church or whatever it is. But so I think all of that was there. I think that was part of the culture. I think it was expected. And I think that was an image that allowed Nephi to see and therefore understand why this tree that gives life could be equated with the Mother of God. And everything that he's pointing to is to get to that point in his vision. That's what he really wants to know about. He really didn't care about the other images. The rest of those things, that was the intro. Oddly enough, apparently his father did say something about that, but he truncates that and doesn't put it as part of his father's vision because he wants to save that for his own discussion. But yeah, very clearly, after we stop thinking he's had his vision of the tree of life, he gets into what it's really about. And then, of course, goes into the future history of the world, how this play between the forces of good and evil, between God and an adversary, play out. And so that's what we get in that discussion. But yeah, I would agree with Val Larson, although I'd quibble on terminology.
Okay. Yeah.
And I'm famous for long answers to short questions.
No, that's great. That's great. What else do we need to talk about with regard to your book? Is there anything we're missing?
Yeah, most of the book, but yeah, we could be here forever if I wanted to repeat it. Yeah. There's some things in there looking at literary forms. So looking at
People
parallelisms.
People are familiar with chiasmus. Is there anything besides that?
There is. I put a section in there on chiasmus. I believe chiasmus is there in the Book of Mormon. One of the things that I do mention is chiasm is also present in Mesoamerican cultures. And I think one of the things that happened early on with chiasm is people thought that only the Hebrews had ever had it. And therefore, this was a proof that the Book of Mormon, was a Hebrew origin. And then they found it in other cultures, and it's in Greek and everywhere else. So it's a real thing, but it isn't as unusual as we thought it was. It is no longer probative of the Book of Mormon. Well, it turns out that it's also in Mesoamerica. But it's in poetry and it is a respected stuff. The other thing is it also tends to be shorter, both in the Bible and in the literature of the New World that has chiastic forms. You can't remember chapter long. So by the time you get to chiasms that are looking at a chapter, or heaven help me, an entire book, I think those are modern artifacts where we're trying too hard. Yeah, we've invented a lot of them. I remember looking at one of them, and it was supposed to explain this entire chapter. Well, except it forgot that chapter didn't begin there in the original, and it was a part of another chapter. And why do you spend that kind of format on this one if it isn't the whole chapter? And so, yeah, I think chiasms are there. I think it's a literary form. I think the shorter ones are really good. I think the longer they get, the less likely they are to be representing an ancient reality and representing more of modern theologians having too much fun.
Are there other literary forms in there?
Yeah, I mean, there is a look at dyadic pairs. Pairs of words that sort of go together. There's another
like good and evil or stuff like that. Is that what you're talking about?
Now I don't even remember which the ones they are, because the ones I'm remembering are the kennings. There was sort of a Mesoamerican concept of a kenning, which is these two words go together and then they mean something.
Yeah, we talked about that last time, I remember.
Yeah, okay. And so there's examples of the kennings in there. So yeah, several things about various literary forms that show up that I think are best explained by saying this is, a poetic form or an artistic representation that would have been on the Nephite plates, And because it deals with structure of sentence, will survive translation, where poetry that requires rhyming would not. So yeah, those things are there. And then in the third one, I take a look at, the lowest level of the sources, what would have been, what kind of information was on the large plates. Were the book names that Mormon used, were they on the large plates? And I think the answer is yes. Although I believe that by the time you get to Nephi, the 2 books of Nephi, I'm pretty sure were not named Nephi on the large plates, but that's another argument. And another reason for people to think I'm kind of weird and off my rocker. But yeah, I think there's a lot of things that happen there because of Mormon. I think Mormon used his history to do his story. So just like the metonymic naming of the silver guy and the gold guy,
right? That
happens more than once, and Mormon is quite willing to use names to further his story. Which is why people who have Jaredite-looking names are always bad guys, almost always bad guys.
Oh.
Yeah, you see a Jaredite-looking name and you should be immediately suspicious because this is probably not going to turn out well.
Cool. Anything else?
No, I don't think so.
All right. Well, Brant Gardner, thank you so much for being here on Gospel Tangents. Really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been fun. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Brant Gardner. Brant, thanks again for sitting down with me a couple of times, and I would encourage everybody to go out and buy those books. Engraven upon plates, printed upon paper. That's one, and the other one is The Plates of Mormon. So you definitely want to check it out if you want to get a good study Book of Mormon and commentary. So it's fantastic. In our next conversation, guess what? I am closing in on 1,000. So tomorrow night, New Year's Day at 7 p.m., prime time, I'm going to hold a celebration for our 1,000th episode. It'll be a Gospel Tangents Live. So please, if you can't make it, send me an email at gospeltangents@gmail.com. Tell me what your favorite videos were. We'll talk about what some of my favorites are. And it's going to be a lot of fun. And also, please comment, send me comments. I'll try to read them live there on air, or if you're not there, send them to me anyway, and we'll read those. So I'm excited to be doing this. 1,000 episodes, that's a lot of episodes. So be sure to sign up, 7 p.m. Mountain Time. That's 9 Eastern, 6 Pacific. So it'll be New Year's night, and it'll be a lot of fun to go back over the last 1,000 episodes. So more to come in 2025. We're also going to do a year in review. I'm going to give out some awards for some of the best books, I think, not only for 2024, but I'm going to talk about some of my favorite books. Oh, maybe I'll go over the past. No, we'll just do all of Mormon history. So some of them are more than 9 years ago. But anyway, so tune in January 1st, 2025, 7 p.m. Mountain Time, and come celebrate. Thanks for listening, and I hope you continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.